We're really thrilled at the discussion that these papers are engendering, and I want to encourage it. We've built in a lot of time for questions, and I know we have students in the audience as well, and I just want to reassure you that your questions are also welcome. And I know it's intimidating because we do have some really incredible scholars here today, but please ask questions if you have them. We really want to hear from everybody, so don't hesitate. It is now my pleasure to introduce Dr. Susan Langdon. Dr. Langdon is professor of Greek art and archaeology at the University of Missouri. We were quite keen to have Dr. Langdon involved with the project since she has done extensive work on one of the areas of strength in the Menil's Antiquities collection, the Greek geometric bronzes. Dr. Langdon's expertise in early Greek art is evident through her numerous publications and complemented by her impressive record of archaeological fieldwork, both in Greece and Cyprus. Her paper today will illustrate the challenges of approaching the corpus of geometric bronze figurines, as well as presenting some ways forward. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Langdon.
Okay, thank you. Thank you so much for the nice introduction, and I want to start with a heartfelt thanks to our hosts, and especially to John and Paul and Sarah for their wonderful, warm hospitality last spring when I came out to see the collection, and everything that I've needed from them, they've answered so quickly, more quickly than I have sometimes answered them back, but I'm excited to be here today and see this starting to culminate. I want to start on a very personal note. This is a topic that is very dear to me, and when this started when I entered graduate school. I entered graduate school for Roman archaeology. I had a big plan, and I was told that I needed to take a Greek art and archaeology course, and then that would fulfill my distribution. And so I said, okay. And the very first slide on the very first day was this horse. And it stopped me in my tracks. It was, I didn't know that much about Greek art. I knew the white statues and things like that. The most modern thing was the earliest that we would see in that course. And I needed to find out more about this. And so in the early 80s, I started my dissertation on Greek geometric bronze figurines. The focus was on the anthropomorphic bronzes. And what I found was I've written several articles about them. I never published my dissertation as a monograph. I was so stymied throughout by problems of provenance that it was frustrating. It's haunted me ever since. I keep meaning to come back to it. And what's so exciting is this CAC project is a dream. I'm finding that there are possible ways forward, and I just want to echo what Betsy said at the beginning of her talk. For our generation that thought you couldn't get any farther with a lot of our material, it looks like maybe this going to be possible. So this is really exciting. And so with all due respect to the Menils and their beautiful collection and their obvious love for antiquity, I'm going to go a little dark with my talk here and the problems. So my title, as many of you will recognize, is inspired by the groundbreaking article by Christopher Chippendale and David Gill in 1993 on the devastating effects of collecting Cycladic figurines, particularly the spectacular destruction of their archaeological context by looters. Other scholars have presented similar studies on the antiquities market that are surely familiar to everyone here. Statistics, prices, and numbers that require a shocking adjustment to reality and the state of scholarship. The points such studies make aren't redundant. The impact of collecting creates a host of issues unique to each material class of esteemed objects. I believe that we can't work effectively with such objects until we understand exactly how the material has been shaped by the history of its rediscovery, the scope, and the specifics. So I want to start with some very brief generalizations. Okay, I hope you can read that, what I'm planning to do today. Some very sort of a superficial and kind of anecdotal review of collecting geometric figurines, and I know a couple of my colleagues here are going to maybe go a little more deeply into collecting. Then I want to turn to some issues of style that are very critical to understanding how we ended up with the corpus of geometric figurines that we have. And by the end, I want to return to the consequences and perhaps some ways forward, which is really the purpose of our gathering. There are both similarities and differences between the history of collecting geometric figurines and that of Cycladic sculptures. For one thing, the bronzes came to awareness mainly through the 19th century big digs at the sanctuaries of Olympia and Delphi. There was no big rush to tomb robbing and site plundering for these as there was for Cycladic figurines. These were controlled and well-protected excavations, although rumor has it that important guests at the early Olympia excavations sometimes found a little bronze horse by their plate at dinner as a party favor. This may be one of the means by which bronzes like this one entered European collections early and were not always attributed to a site. And so, Berlin horse, I'm looking at you. There is no provenience on that, actually. But the figurines were undoubtedly collectibles, and many entered European and American museums and collections from the late 19th into the early 20th centuries. And just as an example, I was going through the database for the British Museum and noticing that there are certain dealers' names that sort of collected quite a few of these. So some of the ones from Zumpolakis in 1920s, I'm going to come back to one of those in just a minute. Like Cycladic figures, their abstract style carried the same sort of primitive appeal to early 20th century artists, modern artists, and collectors as Bronze Age and tribal arts. And the point is well made by the example of the Karditsa warrior, which is very well known now. It was sketched by the Dada artist Francis Picabia in one of his transparencies and labeled African Statuette and Women. Whatever the reason for his title, it's clear that he sketched it out of the 1934 book L'Art en Grèce, an important source of exquisite black and white photographs of Greek art from Neolithic through Byzantine. This was compiled by Christian Zervos, who was a modernist art critic and a specialist in Picasso. And so there's almost no text about the works of art in there, but there are essays at the end by figures like Le Corbusier on the modernist impulse in these primitive early works. And I think it's an important way that some of this material was disseminated for inspiration. Auguste Rodin. I wanted to mention, when you see the Karditsa warrior now, his shield is mounted correctly on his back, and that's the way it's always photographed. And so for just a very short time of this one photograph, it was on the arm, and that's obviously where he got his drawing. Okay, Auguste Rodin had one of these little geometric figures in his own Antiquities collection, possibly an inspiration. For this audience, the potential dire effects of collecting and the impact of desirable pedigree on value is drearily familiar. For example, Corinthian style, which is an example we started with, is the gold standard for horses. And if it had been published in a scholarly work, no matter how brief its known history, the price can become shocking. So looking around, I know you can't read the details, looking around on the internet for what's selling these days. This was recently on the market. It is a very fine Corinthian style horse. So we have it that is labeled as Corinthian. It commanded $842,000. And it has almost no provenance, but it was published in a scholarly book on geometric horses. Forgeries may have begun as early as the 1920s, and I want to come back to this kind of puzzling statuette from the British Museum. This is one from the Zumpolakis sales. It has peculiar clothing, and it's always bothered me. It has a tunic, it has pants. None of this is right. The hands are kind of weird. The face looks like a little frog. It's not very attractive, but it could be geometric. It was certainly, it still is like this on the British Museum website. I found in an 1989 Sotheby's catalog, a medieval figure, I think it's published as Byzantine, looks so much like it that I'm wondering now, and I don't know the answer, whether I'm not questioning the authenticity of a medieval figure, but was the so-called geometric one, is that simply a legitimate medieval piece that happens to look like a geometric style, or was it actually an attempt to make something older that would have more value back in 1929? So I'm talking about this with a British Museum curator these days. As pocket-sized treasures, these bronzes particularly suffered in World War II. Here's an interesting example. There are 3 figures from Dodona, from the Sanctuary of Zeus, that were on tripod handles, or on tripods. One of them went missing in World War II. And when I was working on my dissertation at Indiana University, I had a position in the slide library, filing the slides that had been used, and I saw this slide that showed a group of ancient bronzes that had been on exhibit in the Indiana University Museum in the 1960s, and right in the center is, I recognized it immediately. Ignore the Syrian photobomb on the left, but I think there's no doubt that this is exactly the same figure. I tried to chase down who had contributed to that exhibition. I got nowhere. It must still be in the United States, but I don't know. I've mentioned to a couple of collectors that they should be on the lookout for it, and if found, it should go immediately back to Greece. And we can hope that that may still happen. Another example is this very well-known if you've ever studied geometric art, this beautiful lion fighting group, brave herder trying to protect his calf from the lion that's grabbed it in his mouth, and his dog is helping. It's a very complex little group, excavated in the Sanctuary of Hera on Samos, disappeared in World War II. In 1991, I was fortunate to be able to visit George Ortiz. He invited me to see his collection, and generously spent a day with me. We had lunch. He lectured me on the collector's view, on the necessity of working on, being able to collect these things. And he certainly had a wonderful eye. He also had this lion group in his collection. And so we talked about the one from Samos, and he said, well, I happen to know where it is right now. It's on the Paris art market, and I'm going to buy it and just quietly give it back to Greece. And it never, as far as I know, it's never happened. I don't know how to understand that story, whether he had it. He can't, I'm not accusing, or it slipped out of his possibility. But it's nice to know that it's probably still alive and well somewhere in the world. Alongside the stream of geometric horses feeding the appetites of collectors were the steady but less frequent blips of human figures popping up on the art market. They are much, much fewer than there are horses, especially in the 1950s and 60s, and I'm learning today and the last week or so how much the 60s are the big moment for geometric bronzes. Mostly exchanging hands among a smallish group. Vladimir Simkovich's collection was dispersed. Eric de Kolb, Andre Erlenmeyer, the de Menils, George Ortiz are some of the big names that had geometric figurines. In the catalog for the 1967 exhibition Master Bronzes, David Mitten, an expert on geometric bronzes, noted most of the works shown here were acquired by their present owners during the last 15 years. Interest has only been growing. Shortly after I defended my dissertation, I met a gentleman who had just been advised to start collecting geometric bronzes. They were going to be the hot thing. I was in touch with him intermittently for several years. I visited him once at his house in Beverly Hills and saw what he had then. It was a growing collection. The last I was in touch with him was about 15 years ago, and he had accumulated nearly 200 pieces, including figurines, fibulae, and other fine early bronzes, jewelry pieces. With unprovenience bronzes, we are heavily reliant on style to take our research further. I want to look at 3 pertinent aspects of geometric figurine style that I think have kind of shaped the way we have what we have now. First is the challenge of uniqueness. Okay, so we're going to look at the problem of uniqueness, and then master designation, and then regionalism. The nature of geometric figurines is that each is a unique work, modeled, pinched, cut, and assembled in wax before it is cast directly from the original. This can lead to so much variation that it can be difficult to know the range of regional styles or even to spot forgeries. Eric de Kolb's large collection included this so-called spinario, a plausible fake, I think, that first appeared in a 1964 Sotheby's auction, and since has disappeared from view as far as I know. It was in the Master Bronzes show, and I don't know who's got it or whatever happened to it. I think it's probably been spotted as kind of a problem piece. But these had to be part of my study when I was doing a dissertation. I was trying to figure out what to do with these strange kind of floating objects. In the 30 years since I first tried to collect all known Greek geometric anthropomorphic figurines, very few editions have come to light from excavations, unless they are still unpublished and I don't know about them. But of the examples of human figures that have passed through auctions and sales catalog in the recent couple of decades, the majority look fairly sketchy to me. I'm concerned whether I've lost my eye because I've been away from my dissertation too long, but there may be some other factors at work. Obviously, it's critical to examine these in person. I'm going to parade just a few of them past you, and if anybody has thoughts, I would love to hear about it. So I'm going from least to most sketchy. So these are fairly recent sales in the later 2008, 2014. The one on the left, half a figure. The kind of thing that bothers me is when the maker has not really committed to a helmet style. As you see there. The one on the right actually looks pretty good. Then there are things like this. These were both 1992. For some of these, I don't know what the prices were. The horse might be okay. They look kind of weirdly like they go together. The man does not look good. It's not an attractive bronze, but that's not a reason not to love it. So, but you see the problem. It's unique. The style is not quite like anything else. This one is another Phoenix ancient art I've discovered is an online, it's not quite an auction, they just put up a price usually. This one is, $100,000 was the price on this, and the kind of problems it presents. This very fine, for instance, this very fine kind of detail in the hair and that spinal incision, and then this lumpy, meaningless base. I'm not sure what they had in mind about that. So there's some kind of strange things going on here, but that's quite a high price to go for. That horse with the little prancy leg is just weird, and the whole thing is lumpy, like a self-respecting geometric maker would have smoothed all that down. That's just not the way they assembled things. And those two, that little pair of a male and female with the odd hat on the female, just look like they were made to go together 2 weeks ago, but that's me, I don't know. This is one that's especially been intriguing to me. I just made a photocopy of this, and I no longer have access to that auction catalog. In 1990, it is iron. It's a foot high. I can't think of anything quite like it at all. I don't know where it is or whatever happened to it. But I kept going back to the face, which bothers me a lot but seemed familiar. And I suddenly, as I was putting this all together, I realized what it reminded me of in a way. And maybe it's those long kind of horizontal eyes. This, of course, some of you will recognize as a well-known ingot god from Enkumi, late Bronze Age. I still have no idea what that means for our other figurine. Although each figurine is already, I'm sorry, I forgot this. This is my favorite. And this is not really relevant to geometric, but it was so ridiculous, I thought we could use a laugh here. So this comes also from the Phoenix Ancient Art, price on request, meaning we have to ask for it. We can't afford it, I think. And it is a nude male statuette and horns of consecration. Okay, it's ridiculous. Although each figurine is already unique before it hits the archaeological record, there are potentially discoverable patterns, such as regional styles, developmental stages in series, and signs of local trends and even individual makers. So I want to turn to this next question: what's in a name? One of the problems of the collector's world and the art market is their mutual propensity for identifying the personality and oeuvre of a master. The problems of designating masters are well known. They flatter the collector, they raise values, they create a false reconstruction of economic and craft practices, and introduce ideological baggage that distracts from or misrepresents the culture under consideration. The connoisseurship approach is based on a premise of personal style to the neglect of regional and other models. So I want to see how this plays out in geometric figurines. A piece recently on the art market, this nice horse bears the name the Schuster horse. Do I have, oh, sorry, I'll go back for a second. The Schuster horse, coincidentally the same collector's name, and I wanted to point out, I can hardly see my own little red lines there. It's another price on request. And if you go down, it names that fact that, oh yeah, that the piece is purchased, considered to be the follower of the master of the New York Centeromachy. So it's not the master, but it's the follower of the master. So I tried to find out a little more about this so-called Schuster horse, and it took me to the fact that this Schuster is a name of a master, Schuster master for Cycladic figurines, and this popped up, and there it is. And I have 3 times I have looked at this slide and thought, did I miss a decimal point? That sold for $16 million, almost $17 million in 2010. So the name master, how does that reflect in the Menil collection? I'm going to be talking about 2 figurines from the Menil collection. The first one is supposedly by a named master, the only really famous named master in geometric bronzes, which is the master of the Boston doe and fawn, this absolutely gorgeous little group of a doe nursing her fawn, and there is a bird perched on her back. The Menil fawn is in many ways so very close to the treatment, especially the head, the ears, the dotted impressed circles, and it's on a chain. And I wanted to point out that this is such a beloved piece in the Boston Museum that for a very short time you could buy a copy of it. I was lucky to get a chance. I don't think they made a special edition of these, and I don't think they're offered for sale anymore. So let's go to the fawn. It has a small head, a flat muzzle, and ears so long it resembles a rabbit. A dotted coat indicated by punch circles, a favorite geometric design, and the underside is formed into a double rectangle stamp. The chain is made of precise, this chain is gorgeous, identical double links of perpendicular loops. This was made by an artist, not a biologist. The eponymous group, attributed to the master of the Boston doe and fawn, also features variations on nature. So a doe with big antlers and ears on her neck. The master of the group was named by David Mitten and George Ortiz together in 1964 or 65. Both of them referenced each other in the naming of this group in their publications. The Sackler Museum, where Mitten was curator, bought a fawn of this group in 1966. Mitten published the master's oeuvre in 1967, and then Ortiz acquired a fawn. At that time, they named 4 by the master, and by 1989, the count had risen to 12, all deer, dogs, there's 1 dog and 1 hare, as revisited in an article by Jean-Louis Zimmermann, an expert on geometric bronze horses. And I don't mean to hold his work up for scorn, but it's a little problematic. He characterized the master as being, quote, incontrovertibly permeated with inspiration from Laconia, Corinth, Arcadia, and perhaps Aetolia, and proposed that the master had apprenticed with a Laconian bronze workshop under whose tutelage he created this rabbit at Olympia. Zimmermann then reconstructed the master's career, spreading it, putting the 12 works in developmental sequence over a 25-year span, culminating with his conclusion that by 725, his style had influenced that of Attic bronze workers. We might agree that this demonstrates the worst aspect of naming a master. The pileup of fictional biography is nearly impossible to suppress and takes us ever farther from the reality of the 8th century craftsmanship. We know little of the organization of geometric figurine production, whether it resided within households or kin groups, or through more formal instruction and apprenticeship within a workshop structure. While the latter concept seems overly formalized for the early Iron Age, the dependency of bronze votive production on the needs, resources, and traffic in sanctuaries suggests that bronze workers traveled to the sanctuaries and produced their wares on site for festivals. But we're not finished with the master of the Boston dough and fawn yet. The home of the master has always been regarded as Boeotia. I think I've got I want us to be looking at this one. And probably Thebes, because the MFA group had the provenience of the Theban Kabirion in 1898, and similar animals in Berlin and the Louvre were said to be from Thebes. Then, in 1966, a miracle. One of the richest graves ever excavated in Boeotia at Kamalovrisi near Lake Paralimni. And this is a tumulus that had been looted, knowingly looted, especially in the early 60s. An intact tumulus over a woman covered in jewelry, gold rings, bracelets, bronze fibulae, a diadem, glass beads, 3 seals, and over a dozen pots, including a stemmed crater, gorgeous, and this is one of my favorite parts, a horse pyxis. For those of you who know the horse pyxides, the lid was off and her hand was in her pyxis. That's great. She was inhumed with 2 infants. On her chest lay 3 bronze figurines, 2 identical to the MFA group. So this is, So this is one of them on the right, and it has not, obviously the surface is not at all very fine. The other one is identical to it, and the third thing is just a deer by itself. The grave has still not been published. It may have looked much like this one, which is in the Athens National Museum. This was excavated in 1964 in Amphiclea. And note the bird figurines, especially. I don't know if you can see it. There's a form of a woman kind of sketched underneath with the placement of the jewelry, but she's wearing bird figurines. So let's stop and assess where this leaves us. We have a known find spot, a datable context about 740, and a funerary use for 3 figurines of the same style, and the alleged provenances of the other pieces do not contradict this, at least central Boeotia. Finding nearly identical groups raises the question of manufacture. Could they have been indirectly a cast from a reusable mold? The Menil fawn, well, we're going to come back to that. Sorry, I want to find my little pair again. There we go. The Menil fawn looks close to the Boston doe, but not much like the Boston fawn. What does that mean? The practice of putting figurines in graves is uncommon outside of Macedonia, where even there it's rare. So one question this raises is, how rare is this practice in Boeotia? Well, it turns out, now we're ready for this one, that I've discovered in the last 2 weeks, I think, of work. There was another rich female grave found at Thebes in 1896, which also had, drumroll please, a doe nursing a fawn. It had also the usual panoply of jewelry, fibulae, a diadem, and it's not clear whether the grave was ever properly excavated or whether there was also an infant, but I'm beginning to wonder. There was also a separate deer figurine within that. The theme of maternal nurturing is popular in geometric bronzes, though more often expressed in horses. When horse figures are involved, it's hard to separate them from notions of value, property, and elite status. That's the way we sort of talk about them. So what does a deer version of the motif do to a political reading? Do we want to step it down? Do we want to add deer into an elite understanding? The connection with a deceased woman and infants offers a possible gendered connection to its meaning. Is it any coincidence that there were infants and possibly a mother with these maternal nurturing feeding groups? Related to this, we have evidence of figurines worn on the body, as the Menil fawn on its chain must have been. It suggests not just baubles in a tree, but a level of personal identification, wearing it on yourself. New questions are raised. Why does Boeotia seem to use figurines idiosyncratically in graves? Is there a connection with women and/or elites and/or cult in such figures? The bird on the deer has been suggested as a divine epiphany, and the deer connected with Artemis. A similar figurine from an unpublished grave, here we go on the left, at Akraphnio, on display in the Thebes Museum, underscores these questions. So another fawn in a grave. new concerns are raised. How plausible is this master scenario that the survival rate of one early Iron Age craftsman is at least 13 pieces, plus there's the Boeotia problem. The Boeotia problem is that there are bull figurines in the Kabirion, quite a few of them. They have a different kind of a style, and there are no horses known. And of course, Boeotia is one of the horsiest of our zones in Greece. In fact, if we remove this stylistic group, there would be few known Boeotian figurines left at all, except for the bulls. Do we have a closely defined regional style rather than a single maker? Claiming a master is hardly defensible now for figurines, although it remains popular, but is there a value in thinking of individual makers? Is connoisseurship as a non-judgmental method possible? Is it still bound to a subjective distinction between conscious and unconscious motor habits? What parts of figure making can be taught? What can the attention to fine details, or what have been called microstyles, tell us? This is always a ripe topic for further discussion. So thinking regionally, I want to move on, will also help solve the problem of a fine little warrior in the Menil Collection. This was published in 10 centuries that shaped the West as Peloponnesian. Geometric painted pottery had regional styles, and since we have human figurines from about 30 different sanctuaries, we can hope to work towards a sense of both regional style and types. There's no reason not to think of regionalism. Based on the provenienced figures from Thessaly, it's fairly certain that this spear-throwing warrior, let's look at some details first. He has the little back-turned plume on his helmet. His hand surely once held a little tiny spear. This is not only Thessalian, not Peloponnesian, but its closest matches are from the site of Philia, which seems to have been leaking figurines in the early 1960s. So one example here, and I'm looking partly at the kind of chiseled approach to the lips, the back-turned helmet. It's not perfect, but there's something about the proportions of that. And then in this one, I think the entire body and that back-turned head, he also has a little crest, looks very similar to this. Philia and Pherae, you'll be hearing more about from Nassos, are the two Thessalian sanctuaries whose hundreds, even thousands of small bronze offerings, to which we can add jewelry-rich graves, emphasize the exceptional importance of bronzesmiths in Thessaly, in the fashioning of group identity and piety in the area. And this brings me to another sad tale of Esteem. In 1993, I was acting curator of ancient art at my university museum and was offered this bronze group as a gift. The only caveat was that the donor was buying the two figurines out of the lot. And my first reaction was, there are figurines in a grave? This is pretty unheard of. The dealer assured us that they did not belong with the rest of the group. But who knows? And so let's see what they are. A bronze smith, one of 6 known, and a little musician. So let's see what we know about bronzesmiths. There is the helmet maker in the Met, one of the most famous works of geometric art that there is. That has no provenance at all. And then there is one that came from Philia. Then there are about 5 others known with no provenience at all. So this was an opportunity to see what these things really mean if they're coming from Thessaly, where bronze working is so very important. Is this from a bronzesmith's grave? The rest of the jewelry looked like female jewelry. Could they, should we ignore what the dealer said about they don't go together? How did they get together? There are so many questions here. It's kind of a lost opportunity. And I want to point out, there's, so how very similar it is to the Philia. And the other figurine in that is a musician that looks very much like one in a private collection in Beverly Hills. I frankly think they're both together now. No musician figures with provenience are known from this period. So where we are, the consequences of esteem and why it matters. I want to turn finally to a more prospective view, what we can do with such a problematic material category, why it matters so very much. So just a few good ones for you to feast on while I described, the significance of Greek geometric figurines can hardly be overstated. All anthropomorphic figurines, and with a small handful of exceptions, all the animals, when we know the provenience, were dedicated as votive offerings in sanctuaries, but maybe graves. We don't know. Where recent studies show that most of these were made, these early Greek sanctuaries where metalworking was practiced functioned as economic centers and meeting points for craftsmen, as well as meeting places for competing elites. Foreign objects from around the Mediterranean were dedicated there, served as models for Greek craftsmen and patrons. In other words, a sanctuary at this time was a hotbed of image making and cultural creativity. Iconography, stories, cult profiles of the gods were all being developed for the rituals and festivals. As figural offerings, the figurines were strategic agents of social change. They included both the first depictions of Greek deities, and perhaps more significant, of themselves, of worshipers, their cult activities, real-life concerns that were being expressed in symbolic ways. Created for permanent public display, they offered a powerful medium for expressions of identity, gender, and religion in the rising polis. So now you know how important they are. Okay, now, my database of 293 human-formed figurines from the Greek mainland and Cycladic islands, excluding Crete and some very iffy specimens, includes 232 with provenience from 31 identified sites. This comes to about 79% with provenience, 21 without. This may not sound so terrible, but let's make a few adjustments. First, let's correct for the Olympia effect. So this is by far the largest group. It came from over a century of excavations, very well protected, and these number 107, so we'll take those out. And then we'll do the same. This brings the unprovenience to about 30% and provenience to 70. We'll do the same for Delphi because that has a similar story. Many figurines, 48 to be exact, and very well protected. And so we end up, at this point, they begin to get away from us, 42% without provenience, and these now come from 29 sanctuaries. Many sites have only one or two, a few have 5 to 8, but then where are all the other ones coming from? With these numbers, it's difficult to trust claims of identifying an individual's style, for example. And let's look at the types. Based on pose or subject, I've sorted them into 40 different types, separating also male, female, and ungendered. In terms of provenience, 8 have no provenience at all, 8 whole types, not just figurines. 6 have very low provenience, so the musicians, I think I said there were none, maybe there's one. The bronzesmiths, 71%, no provenience. Seated males, lion fighter, male rider, female rider. 14 out of 39, or 36% of types, have low or no provenience at all. So 42% of figures without provenience is bad, but more than 1 out of 3 types seems even worse. We can do a lot with gender. I want to end on a higher note. If that's what this is. Going through the same types, I found marked asymmetries among gender lines, and this is where I think there's some fruitful things to be doing, is using the types. So the males outnumber females, 224 to 49. They are over 4 times as numerous. They turn up at twice as many sanctuaries as females, so we have 10 types of females at 12 different sanctuaries, male figurines 27 types at 23 different sanctuaries, and they're strongly weighted towards male-identified activities. So, for example, males are generally products of new and local invention. They're treated with broad creativity. They tend towards displays of high action, heroic, and daily activities in which male viewers and donors can see themselves represented. Archer, herder, bronze worker, chariot driver, lion fighter, minotaur, horseman. For females, over half derive from 3 basic types of Near Eastern and Aegean goddesses and are dominated by very passive poses. They stand, they may put their hands on their thighs, and they may put their hands out to their sides. A very few sit on a horse or dance, or carry a pot on their head. For females, the use of Near Eastern goddess types in their evident otherness may well have distanced female viewers from finding a source of empowerment or identification. Aside from one unprovenienced specimen, child nurturing, for example, is not represented. The point is the simultaneous construction of identity and agency for males, but a narrow and distancing representation for females. And this is at the rise of these new urban centers. This heroic view of the world of men was deployed in fine materials and authoritative imagery within the most important religious contexts of the early states. While this is admittedly brief and simplified reconstruction, and I can talk at length about it, it's based on a framework of provenience figurines. If we are fully aware of the parameters of this corpus of bronzes, including the consequences of their esteem, I believe we can find ways to incorporate the unprovenience pieces as well. Thank you. Good.
We have time for a couple of questions. Dr. Langdon.
Thanks, that was fascinating. I just have a question, and maybe it's not for you, and maybe it's for you three organizers, but you used the terms provenience and provenance interchangeably, and so I'm just wondering, do you think of them as the same thing?
I don't. I realized I was doing that in my paper as I was writing it. I went through, and I think the way I'm distinguishing, and I don't know how much others adhere to this, is that provenance tends to be the history of the piece. Provenience tends to be the original source, the original
archaeological
home.
find spot.
Yes, that's
okay.
right.
Just so
and
we're all on the same page.
It's when you're speaking, it's easier to say provenance, and I've noticed that other people have been saying that term more, and so I think I fell into it while I was speaking here.
So I'm using undocumented, so I don't fall into either trap.
Okay.
That's what I'm.
I just wanted to say thank you so much for talking about Boston's wonderful bronze. It's not on, regrettably, it's not on view, and so
It's
your
not.
talk has me running back to Boston to get it out to our public. But I also wanted to talk about, or comment a little bit about the search for a master. Which certainly, is motivated in the market. Adds to the status and the price of a piece. But I also think for the public or for museum goers, the anonymity of our objects, the absence of a known maker, is a challenge for people. And so I think a possible story, to comment a little bit on Dr. Rose's presentation last night, a new narrative could be to, if we are able to put out the fawn,
Yes.
the Doan fawn, is to talk about that or engage our audiences in that issue in whatever way we can. So I hope to be able to do that.
That's a great point, and I also confess that probably many of you know this, when you start working closely with a category of material, you get to know it, you feel like you recognize personalized traces in these things. And that's why I wanted to raise the idea of at least looking for individuals. And if we use the name, I think the trouble is when the name gets onto the art market. But I do very much believe in looking for as much individuality and sense of the maker as we can. It tells us a lot. It's possible that if this one maker was creating figurines for graves in one little zone, it's possible that he is those are more protected perhaps. And I don't know, but I recognize that maybe the storyline is sometimes worth letting it happen. I want to say one more thing about in 1991, I curated an exhibition on Greek geometric art, and I went to the MFA to request if I could borrow this one piece, and actually several others in the collection. And I met with Emily and Cornelius Vermeulen, and Emily said, "This is my favorite piece in the entire museum." And so so she said, "No, you can't have that. Can't leave Boston." But they were very generous. We had many other things. And I have always assumed, I don't know it for sure, but I've always assumed that she requested a copy of it because she loved it so much and that they sold a few more. I paid a lot for it, but it's a wonderful piece.
Well, we can look into that.
Yes.
Thank you so much. That was fascinating. I have a comment and a question. The comment is, it is perhaps indicative of the two different scientific cultures that the attribution to master game has been systematically avoided by scholars who were involved in the publications of the great amounts of materials in the sanctuaries, where we have large amounts of material, and as it has been proven and it is widely accepted, attributed to regional workshops. So the idea of worship is there now, it has been established, but people have been very, very hesitant to go deeper to this level of recognizing individual hands. Or if they have done it, it hasn't become as sensational as, for example, the wonderful examples you discussed. So there is something in this difference of treatment in what is essentially the same body of material. My question, I'm completely fascinated by the questions you raised. They are tremendously refreshing, and they give, I believe they have the potential to give new impetus to the study of this early type of Greek art. Do you see any potential to scientific analysis? Because some problems may be solved if we have a basis against which to compare. Have you thought about that?
Yes. I know that we can do metal studies now that most of them used to be invasive, and these are valuable enough that it would be hard to make a request and have have a museum or a collection willing to drill out a bit of it. And I think now we can there's a lot more potential for that. There needs to be, I guess, more of a data bank of data on which to compare these things. I know that some scholars have gone in this direction. One was Claude Rollet, who was looking at some of the material from Delphi, and he recognized that there was a phase, I believe, where some of the Delphi bronzes seemed to have been melted down Mycenaean works because of the specific composition. That's right. And so I think there's a lot of potential now going ahead. And I also want to say another potential avenue that I don't know enough about is looking at the construction of these. And I know that there was a dissertation done by Susan Jones, which I just requested interlibrary loan, and it came on a microfilm, so I haven't had time to flip through that yet, where she, I think, has maybe suggested that indirect casting might have been possible, and there might be some replications of possible. And it's the kind of knowledge that, for instance, looking at possible forgeries, I think, for instance, that little prancing horse does not look like it's constructed in the right way. So I think there is a lot of potential for future study.
Speaking of which, I was thinking of the iron figure. Yeah. It doesn't look like anything of the excavated iron figures that I have in my mind.
Okay, I didn't think so.
So
yeah.
You rightly questioned it.
All right.
Thank you so much. Just thank Dr. Langdon again. Thank you. One of the real pleasures that this project has afforded has been getting to know the scholars who some of you are meeting today, and of course some of you have known each other for years, and it's really been a particular pleasure for me to get to know all of you. And our next speaker, Dr. Nassos Papalexandrou, comes to us from the University of Texas in Austin, where he is Associate Professor of Art and Archaeology. Coming from what in Texas terms is just down the road, Nassos has been able to visit us several times and has been a truly invigorating intellectual presence in our collaborative efforts, and we thank him for that. Dr. Papalexandrou is a distinguished author whose work explores the interactions between people and objects, both in the past and in their current contexts of display. His paper, like Dr. Langdon's, investigates the early Greek bronzes, and in particular their meaning as part of the collection of John and Dominique de Menil. Please welcome Dr. Nassos Papalexandrou.
Thank you. I think at this point it won't be redundant to thank again John and Sarah and Paul for the conception and the courage to move this along and for facilitating my research. And I may have been overbearing, and thank you for your patience, even for fielding questions at the 11th hour. I'm fascinated about the project, and I'm fascinated about the future dimension that enframes it. In October 5th, 1962, John and Dominique de Menil purchased a group of 31 bronze artifacts from Alexander Iolas, the well-known art dealer who largely helped the Menils shape their taste and their collection. These artifacts have been known to scholarship since 1970, year of the epoch-making exhibition 10 Centuries That Shaped the West, Greek and Roman Art in Texas Collections, held at Rice University. Dominique de Menil curated the show with her usual diligence and attention to detail. The scholarly aspect of the show was entrusted to archaeologist Herbert Hoffman, who researched and edited the exhibition catalog. The catalog publishes the bronzes purchased in 1962 as a group of geometric bronzes from Thessaly, and Herbert's analysis in the preamble of the entries corroborates the dealer's indication of a Thessalian provenance by invoking various typological and stylistic affinities of numerous items in this group with bronzes officially excavated at a few Thessalian sites. My paper focuses on a distinct subgroup of the original purchase, which comprises a number of horse figurines on display about 30 feet from where I'm standing now, and hopefully accessible at some point during this conference. Thank you. This equine focus started as an arbitrary scholarly indulgence, but as I intend to show, it may be warranted by what seems to have been a particular predilection of Dominique and John de Menil. My presentation unfolds as a triptych. I think it's an appropriate metaphor in this context. It has lots of poetic affordances, so to speak. First, taking my cue from the bronzes from Thessaly, I attempt to explore them as symptomatic of John and Dominique's aesthetic preoccupation with early Greek artifacts, a dimension of their collecting practice, the historicization of which yields insights about the long-term actualization of the Menil aesthetic and collecting philosophy. Second, I explore the possibility of tracing the provenance of the Thessalian group to the Thessalian sanctuary of Athena Itonia, near Philia. This proposal has been circulating in scholarship for a while, but I want to problematize it. Finally, my investigative triptych is complemented by a consideration of current scholarly thinking on bronze horses from Thessaly. As a scholar particularly interested in the dense web of relationships between humans and objects, I'm intrigued by the overarching question of how John and Dominique thought about the bronzes, how they interacted with them physically and cognitively, and how their experience informed the installation of the horses in the permanent exhibit. I must confess that my archival forays did not yield any evidence that speaks straightforwardly to these questions.
They can be answered to some extent against the light of the Menil's overarching preoccupations, insightfully described by anthropologist Pamela Smart as the sacred modern. The triptych. The purchase of the Thessalian bronzes in 1962 occurs at a seminal turning point in the development of the Menil collection of antiquities and other artworks. And here I'm going to be a little bit redundant again, because we have just heard very nicely from Paul this stage of the Menil's preoccupation with antiquities. Starting in 1949 and into the 50s, the Menils had already put together the nucleus of their collection of classical antiquities. Their involvement Their involvement with the University of St. Thomas at this time resulted in the creation of the art department at the University of St. Thomas. Its multifarious operations were generously sponsored by the Menils, who had already offered the core of their private collection as a loan catering to teaching needs. The intensification of the Menils' collecting of antiquities must partly derive from their committed sponsorship of the teaching of art at this institution. They strongly believed that only through intimate physical or sensory encounters would young students be able to hone their own aesthetic sensibility and knowledge of the visual and material cultures of the past. It is therefore not surprising that it was precisely during the years of Dominique's active teaching and curating of exhibitions that the Menil collection of antiquities grew considerably. But enhancing the teaching art collection at St. Thomas is only partially to account for the Menil's interest in early Greek bronzes. Already in 1961, the Menils had already purchased an impressive bronze horse statuette from the Swiss-based dealer Nicholas Kotoulakis, whose name has already come up in our discussions. As Dominique found out in the late 60s, the bronze was suspect of being a forgery, and in 1970, she sent it back to Kotoulakis. But even forgeries have value when we try to historicize things, thanks to my focus on this piece. The horse was first shown on an important show held at Nelson Rockefeller's Museum of Primitive Art in New York City under the title, The John and Dominique de Menil Collection. The show opened its doors to the public on November 21st, 1962, that is only a month and a half after the purchase of the horses and other items of the Thessalian group. Paul Davis kindly suggests to me that purchases of artworks often happen in anticipation of important exhibits curated by Dominique de Menil. Is it possible that the group of Thessalian bronzes was acquired for the 1962 show, but somehow never made it to it? However this may have been, the inclusion of the geometric period bronze horse in the show is indicative of a deeper reflection of the Menils on early Greek art. The exhibition at the Museum of Primitive Art largely focused on the Menils' holdings of non-Western art, especially on their growing collection of artifacts from Africa. I have not been able to find the exact placement of the Greek horse within the presentational economy of the show. It is clear to me, however, that it was included not as an artifact representing the Greek culture as the paragon of Western civilization. The show brought together variegated works from a number of cultures that were tied together by a distinct affinity, a kinship of spirit and creative genius that was ecumenical, atemporal, and irreducible to cultural particularities. As Dominique herself put it very clearly in her short but pithy introduction to the catalogue of the exhibition, quote, and I think a lengthy quotation is proper in this context, "The figurines, animals, fetishes, masks, ceremonial or useful objects, they are called primitive for want of better name. are the most sincere and the most unself-conscious art that ever was and never will be. They are what remains of the childhood of humanity. They are plunges into the depths of the unconscious. However great the artist of today or tomorrow, he will never be as innocent as the primitive artist, strangely involved and detached at the same time. Dominique de Menil. Dominique viewed all artifacts in this exhibit as belonging to a uniform register of material and visual creativity. She sensed them as springing from an expressive faculty that is global, fundamentally humane, unconscious, and also untempered by the self-consciousness we associate with what has been defined as art since the Renaissance. In the same introduction, Dominique's concluding statement bespeaks her understanding that the primitive art of the exhibition encapsulates fundamental functions of an oral state of mind that is no less ingenious than the best ever achieved by Western culture. Quote, "What could never have been written is there, all the dreams and anguishes of man. The hunger for food and sex and security, the terrors of night and death, the thirst for life, and the hope of survival." End of quote. It is no accident that this vision of art was formulated in what was the first national venue to showcase the growing collection. I see this less as a statement of collecting philosophy than as a doctrine for a special relationship with art, one that is at once affective and cognitive, seeking to attain a higher level of spirituality. In this program of action, Dominique's understanding of the geometric horse must be seen as going against the grain of understandings of early Greek art during this period. These understandings were premised on a notion of early Greek art as a precocious childhood of a unique artistic phenomenon that would come to fruition in the classical period through the coming of age of the archaic period. Although scholars acknowledged in them certain qualities of distinction, the interest in them was their Greekness. Contrary to this, Dominique placed the specimen of early Greek art in a new nexus. Here, the nostalgic quest for reaching back to the childhood of humanity is premised on a different sense of childhood. Not the early stages of anticipation of something grander to come, but a quest for innocence, automation, and authenticity of mind and spirit. I would go as far as to venture that the Greek geometric horse appealed to both Dominique and John de Menil precisely because of the horse's perceived capacity to embody conception, springing, to quote Dominique again, the depths of the unconscious. Dominique's preoccupations, I would say Dominique's and John's preoccupations, derive from her overarching aesthetic interests, premised on the belief that sensory intercourse with art has a redeeming quality as it offers pathways to an enhanced spirituality. This fundamental preoccupation illuminates the alignment between the Menil's collecting of surrealist works and their invested interest in African art, Cycladic art, early Greek art, and arts from non-traditional areas. Dominique and John de Menil would have had encounters with the famous Cycladic sculptures in bronze and specimens of early Greek small-scale art in bronze as early as their years in Paris. Important artifacts of these cultures at the Metropolitan Museum of Art would have triggered their fascination and willingness to expand their collection to these areas as well. I know that they were in touch, for example, with Dietrich von Bottmer, who encouraged and he was in conversation with them. As I was able to ascertain on the basis of a note handwritten by John de Menil, they purchased the Thessalian group from Alexander Iolas the same day they acquired a painting by Van Gogh. This transaction has left no other written traces, but one imagines that Aeolus, who had had a formative collaboration with the Menil since the late 40s, would have been keen on persuading John and Dominique that the bronzes were appropriate for their collection. Their austere abstract qualities were on a par with the structured minimalism of Cycladic marble figurines. Dominique would have sensed that despite their physical differences and the temporal and geographical distance, these artifacts derived from the same creative impulses. Perhaps this is why Dominique installed them back to back as two sides of the same coin 30 feet away from where I'm standing now. The Menils would have been aware of the preoccupation of many a modernist artist, Picasso, Moore, Brancusi, Picabia, with the Cycladic figurines, and as Susan showed, also with early geometric art, a preoccupation usually invoked by prehistorians to valorize the status of Cycladic figurines as objects of international relevance. But this special pleading would have been unnecessary for the Menils, who had already started forging a sensibility widely ecumenical and consciously attuned to threads common in the arts from Africa, the Aegean, Thessaly, Oceania, Antarctica, and whatnot. One more bronze of the geometric period was added to the Menil Collection in 1981, a manifestation of Dominique's continuing interest and preoccupation with early Greek bronze horses 19 years after the original purchase of Thessalian bronzes and 10 years after 10 centuries. This was not a personal purchase mediated, as was often the case, by a mentoring figure like Aeolus, or at least no such evidence emerged during my research. Instead, it was the Menil Foundation that purchased the bronze statuette from the Edward Mering Gallery at New York City. And I think we need to discuss whether this difference, the personal agency of the collector versus the foundation, has a formative impact on how things evolved. In terms of size, type, date, formal elements, and overall quality, this horse complements the group of the original 1962 purchase. It has no provenance, but its style and technical characteristics seem to point to Thessaly. The archival file does not contain any other information as to how this horse might have been brought to Dominique's attention. The horse features a few details that set it apart from the other Thessalian horses in the Menil group. I mentioned, for example, the punched circles on its haunches and neck, and the idiosyncratic rendering of the small head. I believe they are visible on the slide, which explodes the scale of what was essentially a very minuscule object that may have well been used as a pendant, a parallel usage as the one Susan demonstrated. It is possible that Dominique added this horse to the collection in anticipation of the grand exhibition in Paris under the title La Rime et la Raison. This exhibit, a landmark event in the life of Dominique and the collection, opened its doors to the public in April 1984, but my presumption is that the first stages of its planning would have already been underway as early as the early 80s. In the introduction of the seminal show, Dominique clearly states that the motivation for her purchases did not obey a programmatic agenda. This collection came together, quote, in French, en perdant la tête par coup de foudre, losing your head like thunderbolt. And I have no doubt that this impulsive response lies behind this last addition to the group of early Greek bronzes, but I suspect that reality, as is always the case, is much, much more complex. So there is much more to find out about this. Be that as it may, this isolated acquisition is the latter bookend in the story of early Greek bronzes in the Menil Collection. In the late 80s, Dominique provided important information and granted permission for the inclusion of the bronze horses to Zimmermann's synthetic study on early Greek horses. Her understanding of how the bronze horses and the other bronze artifacts fit into the invisible warp that ties the exhibit next door together is evident in her careful curatorial gestures. And Paul confirms to me that what we see in this early part of the exhibit is precisely has the imprint of Dominique's curatorial hand. So it is a privilege to be able to witness it in this present day when we try to historicize and to study it as an artifact of its own time. I hypothesized, therefore, that Dominique and John de Menil had a love of horses and were fond of their various renderings in art. In a brief note introducing the section Art of Ancient Cultures in a book published by the Menil Foundation on the Menil Collection in 1987, it was then reappeared in 1997, Dominique urges the reader to view the horses as plastic creations, quote, illustrating the intrinsic dignity of horses, end of quote. At the same time, she writes about animals as sources of mystical powers and as gifts men had to make to the gods, eminently noble, are her words. These words are very brief, but in some sense, they are inversely analogous to their implications. Since their publication in the exhibition catalog 10 Centuries That Shaped the West, the horses and other artifacts of the original 1962 purchase have been associated, we have seen it already, with Thessaly. One presumes that Alexander Iolas, who sold the bronzes to John and Dominique, would have been well aware of the provenance. Indeed, Herbert Hoffman emphasizes with confidence that, quote, there is every indication that this dealer provenance can be trusted, end of quote. This confidence derives largely from the close affinities of type and style between the Menil bronzes and artifacts discovered in controlled excavations undertaken by archaeologist Dimitrios Theocharis at the sanctuary of Athena Itonia at Philia, near Cardiche, in the heartland of Thessaly. This was the sort of natural sanctuary of Thessalians in antiquity from an early period onwards. These excavations were undertaken as a desperate attempt to salvage information and artifacts from a site severely destroyed by clandestine excavations in 1960. The story is as sad as it can be because the local farmers who profited from the destruction of the site colluded with local authorities in concealing the illegal operation from the archaeological service for a long time. Theocharis undertook trial excavations in 1962 and then excavated systematically every year until 1967. Ima Kilian Dirlmaya produced the final systematic publication of some 3,000 bronzes found during Theocharis' excavations, an impressive study that appeared in 2002. In the study, Kilian hypothesizes that the artifacts looted from Greece as a result of the 1960 illegal operation at Philia were widely dispersed. She writes, though, assuming that two main groups from the sanctuary of Athena can be identified. One ended up in the Nie Carlsberg Glyptothek in Copenhagen, the other in the group in the Menil Collection. The former group was published by Jette Christiansen in 1992, who tentatively offers the sanctuary of Athena Itonia at Philia as the site of provenance. This is a group of about 50 bronzes acquired on the art market in 1963. As we have seen, the other group was published by Herbert Hoffman, who mentions Philia as a site with stylistically similar artifacts as those in the Menil Collection. When I undertook research on the bronze horses, my initial reaction was to seek contextually excavated bronzes in Thessalian sanctuaries. A significant group had been excavated early in the 20th century at the sanctuary of Zeus Thalios and Artemis Enodia at Pherae, but they came from a mixed deposit of the 4th century BCE. So you cannot contextualize very firmly with this soupy situation at Pherae. I turned to Kilian Diermeier's publication with great anticipation, hoping to find comparanda from the systematically excavated layers of the Philia sanctuary. These were largely disturbed, of course, but still nothing beats an actual and verified provenance. You cannot imagine my surprise and disappointment when I found that the systematic excavations by Theocharis yielded no bronzes, no bronze horses, and therefore no comparanda for the groups in Houston and Copenhagen. How is this possible? The systematic excavation yielded about 3,000 bronzes, actually more than 3,000 bronzes, a sample sufficiently large to accommodate at least a percentage of bronze horses. Their deposition at the sanctuary is only to be expected when one takes into account that other important sanctuaries have yielded good numbers of bronze horses dating to the geometric period I just mentioned, Pherae. And if we want to look more widely, Delphi and Olympia are the obvious sites. Yet, with the exception of a minuscule head of a horse, a miscast one, there are no excavated bronze horses from the most important sanctuary in Thessaly, a region of Greece famous for horse breeding, and as Maria Mili has shown in her recent seminal study on Thessalian religion, replete with religious institutions and beliefs in which horses play a significant role. And Susan has already made the same comment very eloquently. I consider the absence of bronze horses from the excavated record of Philia sanctuary a paradox. And all I can do is formulate some questions. Is the absence of bronze horses from the excavated record in Philia reason enough to doubt the provenance of the bronze horses and other artifacts in the Thessalian sanctuary of Athena Itonia? Is it possible that the clandestine activity at the sanctuary was aimed at collecting as many bronze horses as possible? My hypothesis is that the looters would have been cognizant of an increased demand for horses on the art market. Thanks, Susan, for laying the ground for me on this. So they made sure to amass as many as possible, but they probably searched for this particular category of art object. And you know, very often you find what you look for. To answer this question, one would have to compare the rates of early Greek and similar horses on sale in the art market up to about 1960 or 61. I have not done the research, but perhaps some quantification here might yield interesting results. As Theocharis and Kilian Diermeier note, the illegal digging at Philia lasted for several months. It makes sense that the perpetrators had the time and the means to micro-search for a specific category of artifact that would yield higher prices on the art market. Unfortunately, we still lack a systematic archaeology of illegal excavations, an account, for example, of the practices, methods, means, frameworks that makes possible the puzzling situations archaeologists and art historians face when they probe into issues of provenance. And I could go on and on about this, because this lack of a descriptive archaeology of illegal practices has emerged in my research again and again. But I have to restrain myself because I see the red flag coming up pretty soon. Finally, I want to address certain questions about the current status of bronze geometric horses in scholarship, essentially adding a footnote to what Sue presented to us a minute ago, and expanding the wonderful set of new questions that she formulated for us. They are very, very enriching and tremendously promising. As we have already seen, a major scholarly landmark in the study of bronze horses of the Greek geometric period was the publication of a synthetic corpus by Jean-Louis Zimmermann in 1989. I do not have time to go into details, but a major contribution of this work was the refinement of classification of about 1,135 bronze horses within well-defined regional groups on the basis of a detailed analysis of both their style and technical characteristics. A coherent group of horses excavated in the sanctuary of Zeus Thalios and Artemis Enodia at Pherai near Volos allowed him to define a Thessalian category in relatively clear terms. According to this classification, half of the horses in the Menil collection are indeed Thessalian, an indication perhaps that could corroborate the Thessalian provenance suggested by the dealer. The rest are a diverse group. One is Laconian, one is Elian, one is Locrian, one Macedonian, and one belongs to a group he defined as Phocian Locrian. Although I'm eager to follow these distinctions, but I honestly cannot decide on what we mean by them when we take into account the socio-political framework, the cultural framework of the 8th century BC. But this is another set of problems. Zimmermann's study is still the definitive point of reference, especially because a later attempt to rethink the corpus was fraught with problems. New advances in understanding artifact categories are the result of new discoveries. Again, thank you, Sue, for making this point so clear, or new methodological approaches to the existing corpus. So far as I can tell, no new discoveries of bronze horses or similar artifacts have happened in Thessaly or in any other region north of the Isthmus. But I stress that the systematic publication of a massive amount of bronzes discovered at Philia provides a secure framework for understanding the bronze horses in the Menil collection and their peers, provided, of course, that the Thessalian Philia provenance is secure. But is it? In the Peloponnese, on the other hand, the situation is a little bit different. The excavations conducted by the German Archaeological Institute at the Pelopion of Olympia yielded no less than 59 bronze horses. This is a substantial amount of new evidence that under favorable circumstances could have yielded new insights for our understanding of this type of artifacts. However, all 59 horses from the Pelopion were retrieved from layers disturbed either in antiquity or in excavations conducted in the 19th century, a period during which systematic excavation had not yet reached the later level of refinement. As a result, the lack of stratigraphic evidence continues to undermine basic issues of chronology and function. Precisely for this reason, Helmut Kirjelies published these valuable finds in summary form according to the classificatory system adopted by Heilmeyer in his 1979 publication of a large number of bronze horses and other animal figures from Olympia. However, the importance of the Olympia finds cannot be emphasized enough. They all derive from layers associated with the earliest cultic antiquity at Olympia, and altar, that is, of burned offerings developed in physical association with the remains of a stone tumulus dating to the 3rd millennium BCE. Finally, the issue of new approaches. New approaches are usually premised on new types of questions, exemplified on the manner and the type of questions Sue Langdon formulated for us a few minutes ago. I would like to conclude by adding to these questions essentially ideas and questions I developed precisely because of my focusing on the Menil group of horses. If I have understood the Menil's mode of thinking, acting, and living as collectors, I may say that the core element in their approach was premised on a deeply relational attachment to objects as vehicles of sensory or cognitive fulfillment. In the last generation, this approach has been unpopular with academics in the field of classical archaeology and art history, mainly because artifacts are supposed to make sense in social and historical context. I am in agreement with this, totally in agreement with this. But my experience with the Menil collection and the bronzes so far has led me to acknowledge there is merit in the Menil way. This merit derives from the fact that the Menil's emphasis on the artifacts themselves and the relationships with the contemporary viewer brings about what I would call the defamiliarization of the familiar. I believe that this defamiliarization or unlearning is a fundamental precondition for posing new questions about objects. In an essay published exactly 10 years ago in the Art Journal, Caroline Dean, a specialist on pre-Columbian art of South America, took issue with the tyranny of the category art and proposed that much of what we study as art is, quote, art only by appropriation, end of quote. I wonder, therefore, whether something would be gained if the Thessalian horses and their peers were detached from the luggage retrojected to them from later periods of Greek art. Thinking of them in tandem with worldwide phenomena of material and visual culture, following Dominique de Menil's experiment next door, opens interpretive pathways and relational possibilities by default excluded in normative approaches such as the one exemplified by Zimmerman, a dated approach as we have already seen. At the very least, one is prompted to look at the horses as elements of a visual and material culture that was still predominantly illiterate. How did people in oral societies relate to what we call art or to categories exemplified by the Menil horses? How did Dominique's bronze horses shape their environments originally? How were they sensed by those who made them and used them? In what mental categories did they belong as artifacts? These questions are only a sampling of what we still have to address regarding the preclassical arts of the Mediterranean. Dominique and John de Menil, I believe, asked these questions a long time ago, and the Menil Collection prompts us to continue reflecting on them. Thank you.
Probably illegal for one of the organizers to ask a question, but I can't help myself. You sort of just dropped an idea and moved on, and I wondered if this may be a question for tomorrow for discussion in the workshop. It may not be a question really for you alone to answer, but you said what we're lacking is an archaeology of illegal excavation. And I think what you mean is a sort of study of how illegal excavation transpires. I wonder if you could maybe here or just say I'll talk about it tomorrow. I don't know. But expound on what you think that would look like. Are you thinking of a sort of report that would come out of knowledge of this? Hopefully not a guide on how to do it, but more a report on what that kind of investigation could tell us.
It's not a good slide. But you may be able to discern the gray areas in black outline. These are the trenches left behind by
they're not excavators, they're diggers. They look like what we saw yesterday in Brian's talk, the lunar, I think you used this very, very apt term, the lunar landscapes left behind in sites in Iraq and the Near East. It's this trace, if we step a little behind of our immediate concerns, is a material intervention to a physical landscape. And it was done with a certain method or a lack of method that has a logic. And I'm not still to terms with this logic. And this is only a small dimension what it is that illegal excavations do to a virgin site. How they go, how they decide what is, I mean, there is a process there too, a methodology, if you will, and we still haven't come to terms with it. Another, because I'm improvising here, I've been thinking about this. In the last 3 years or 4, and as a result of the crisis in Greece, you're all familiar about the economic crisis, which is a social crisis, there has been a tremendous, tremendous increase in illegal excavation. And it is almost every day in the news, in the Greek press, the news of the successes of the special unit the police has to pursue the agents and collect their products. There is a lot of information there about the whole systemic structure of these operations. And last week or 2 weeks ago, there was a major inroads made because they intercepted a gang that was so expansive with dozens of members all over Greece and international collections. So we only partially know about the workings of this gang, and I believe that if we become more cognizant, it will facilitate our sort of trying to go back to the processes that created this messy situation we try to untangle by posing the provenance question. So I don't have a definite answer, but this is something we have to work by systematizing what often becomes the arcane esoteric knowledge of those involved in the field. I mean, either in museums or excavators, et cetera, et cetera. But I throw it out there as a dimension of the problems we should be asking and the initiatives perhaps we have to formulate and pursue systematically.
But I think this is exactly why we are having this conference, because, sorry, it's me, yeah, sorry, because you are approaching it from an art historical point of view, and this is why not only do we need to be collaborative within art history, we need to be collaborative with anthropology, with archaeology, because there are anthropologists doing this exact research all over the world.
I'm very happy.
Right, so maybe, and there is actually someone who's working on this in Greece. So there are people with this knowledge, and that's why we need these kinds of conferences to bring us together. So tomorrow I will tell you about, this is exactly what I do in Jordan, and so I'll tell you a bit about that, but there are also other people doing this exact stuff so that we can bring it all together and get a better idea of the archaeology of illegal excavation.
Thank you, Nassos, that was wonderful. These are two very different kinds of comments. A response to your question of Sue when she spoke about the bronzes, and you asked about a scientific facility where the authenticity of the bronzes could be determined. Ernst Pernichka, who did the analysis of the soil associated with the gold of Troy in the Penn Museum, he has a laboratory in Mannheim, and this is what he does. He's an archaeometallurgist, and he analyzes bronzes and determines, based on metallurgical content, whether or not the bronze is apt to be ancient or not to be ancient. And your comment about looters, and this ties into what Morag was saying, the looters looking for bronze horses when they're looting a particular site in the 60s. So a kind of looting to order. And I see this now in Turkey. There is a tomb excavated by Bryn Mawr College called Karaburun in southwestern Turkey. The paintings, which date to about 470 BC, were famous, reproduced all over the world. And 3 years ago, looters broke into the tomb with conservators in tow and took the paintings off the walls. Those can never be sold, of course, on the art market because they're too famous. The provenance is too well known, or provenience is too well known. So it must again have been a kind of theft to order. Someone wanted these paintings. They were going to acquire them and put them in a place where no one but their friends would ever see them. And this may be a trend, I'm not sure, the increase in thefts to order or looting to order, but it ties into what Morag and you were saying.
This is just a quick intervention, and I'm speaking last, but I'm going to say something about provenance by science, so, in which I'm not expert, but I'll say something about it.
Thank you. This was a great talk. I really enjoyed it. And what I want to bring up the point of, we've both kind of hammered a little bit at Zimmerman's study. As you know, this was based also, I think, partly inspired by Hermann, who, was it 69 or 64, did the first study of attributing horses regionally like this. And there's like three centerpieces. There's the Argive, the Laconian, and the Corinthian. And then from there on, Zimmermann went on so many other sort of subcategories of this. And one of the problems is that one of the star of all this is sort of the Corinthian style, and it's made so much impact on Thessalian style and so forth. And one of the ironies is that there's never been a Corinthian horse found in Corinth. It's a problem. It's a problem. And there were clever ways of arguing this. A couple of years ago, the Greek service excavated the first Corinthian horse in Corinth. It was in a grave. It's not published. I have a picture on my computer, which I can show you later. It does not look like a Corinthian horse at all.
But it is.
Yes. So my question is, and I'm sure you don't have maybe an immediate answer. We should talk more. But what would be the future of studying horses? I think maybe this model isn't necessarily wrong, but needs a little bit of challenging. Are you thinking of like a next step in working on horses that you've revealed problems with the philia, location for horses, and thoughts on regionalism now?
We have to theoretically define what we mean, or what are the premises. Oh. Yeah. Sorry for this. I can't project, but I have been speaking for a long time. I believe that this initial, there is science. Going back to Hermann, and even Zimmermann is very, very defensive and systematic. But the premises, and I slightly hinted at this, we haven't really problematized what we mean Thessalian. This goes back to what you suggested about the anthropomorphic figurines, how this whole system works. Is the archaeological evidence sufficient enough to allow us insight? We can gain insights by focusing on technique, but what I think we haven't done sufficiently enough is look at the ethnological record about how these industries are organized in other societies that would provide us for models to think with in terms of organization of workshops, how they gain their ideas, how the marketing happens, the production, et cetera, et cetera. There are some insights because we know that the sanctuaries were centers of production. We have the evidence. But another dimension of this, Susan, is that there is a discrepancy on the emphasis, anything pre-classical, receives versus the traditional focus on classical archaeology, perhaps not so much in Europe, but people do not go back to dig through and revitalize as you did. I tried to do that, this early period, which is insufficiently represented worldwide, I believe. So I don't know whether this answers your question. I dealt with, like you, with early stuff 20 years ago, and then I put it aside, and now this prompts me to go back and revisit it with fresh eyes that have to take into account the questions we raise in this conference.
Thank you so much for your talk. I'm really enamored with the idea of art is art only by appropriation, so I'm curious, from your opinion, how you see this idea affecting mainstream pedagogy in universities or just the discussion of classical art in general, either through your own research or through your colleagues.
Art carries with it a very, very implicit luggage, implicit notions of quality, processes, intellectual investment, the esteem that Susan talked about. I think we have to put this term and its luggage aside, or problematize it before putting aside. It just thinks simply and neutrally about material and visual culture. And I think this is not just a trend, it's a way of looking at things for what they are. Because I believe, there is a very, very representative audience here, that nobody would take issue with thinking of things in terms of material and visual culture. I believe in other domains, anthropology, for example, or in the study of Aegean prehistory, where such notions cannot be retrojected back with consequences. They are more ahead than in classical archaeology, which for issues of esteem and of practices introduced long ago, we have to think of the art of classical Greece as the art of the Renaissance, but these are two completely different domains. So we have to make a little adjustment, so to speak, in approach and mentality, and always define the terms in terms of how we use them. Thank you.
That was a wonderful note to end on, to end our morning on. Thank you so much. We are breaking for lunch now. I want to remind you all, if you didn't notice in your program, there is a map of the area around the Menil with restaurants noted so that you can find some places for lunch within walking distance. We will reconvene at 2 o'clock exactly. So we hope that you'll join us for the afternoon session at that time. And following actually on something that Nassos asked about, the galleries will be open at the end of the afternoon session. And we hope to have the opportunity to have conversations in the gallery. So that's your carrot. Stick around. We'll have fun. All right, have a good lunch. Thank you.